Hello, welcome to our final session for the afternoon called Building on Best Practice Forest Restoration. Our presenters for this session are myself, Matthew Kennedy, who is the Environmental Project Coordinators at Envite Environment Victoria, Patrick Pigott, who is a Research Ecologist for Parks Victoria, and Melinda Greenfield, who is a Senior Research Officer in the Fenner School of Environment and Society at the Australian National University. I'll tell you a bit more about each of those presenters before they talk later in the session. The purpose of this session is to tell you about a landscape-scale forest restoration experiment in East Gippsland that my team and collaborators are about to embark on. The project is an exciting opportunity to merge science and practice. However, being an ecologist, I have a lot to learn about growing forests. Therefore, I'm also hoping that this session will provide our team with an opportunity to learn from people who are attending this workshop with experience in forestry, forest ecology, forest regeneration, and restoration. We'll start with a presentation from me about the background and experimental design of the Silvertop project, followed directly by Matthew Kennedy, who will discuss ideas for implementing this landscape-scale experimental restoration work. After Matt's presentation, we will open up the discussion for feedback on what we have just presented. We welcome your feedback, insights, experience, and suggestions to help maximize the benefits and outcomes from this project. Then we'll hear from Patrick Pigott, who has experience in landscape-scale thinning projects, although in a different forest type and for a different reason. He will talk to us about what he's learned from helping to implement landscape-scale experiments. Following Patrick's presentation, we will again open the floor to wider discussion. And just before wrapping up, our local community engagement officer and senior field officer, Melinda Greenfield, will introduce herself to you and let you know how you can get in touch with us in the future if you would like to continue this discussion or offer additional advice or suggestions outside of the workshop. She will also tell you about opportunities for volunteering and community involvement in the Silvertop project in the future. All right, so I will start here with sharing my screen. And hopefully the technology gods are looking favorably on us for this presentation. All right, there's people constantly coming into this. So for those of you who might have just joined us, my name is Youngentob, and I'm going to talk to you about a project we're about to embark on to restore nutritional landscapes in East Gippsland. I'll start with a quick recap and provide some background to this project. There's actually a keynote presentation that's available on our workshop website that provides a lot more background and information on why we're doing this project that you would find really interesting. If you haven't listened to it, it will help you understand what we're talking about today. But I'm going to go through some of the key points just to get those of you up to speed who might not have had time to check it out before the workshop. I'll talk to you about our project design and our ideas for how we might suppress silvertop and get some more nutritious, locally appropriate tree species to grow. Then I'll talk about the ongoing management and monitoring that we have planned for these sites. And the last thing that we're going to talk about are the implementation strategies. And for that, I'll be handing it over to Matthew Kennedy from Envite Environment, who we're partnering with to deliver this project. I just have to move this little screen again. Sorry, everyone, bear with me. Oh. So, not all food for folivores is created equal. Some trees are better food than others. The nutritional quality of trees in a forest largely determines the nutritional quality of the landscape for folivores. Forests that have trees with more nutrients and less toxins tend to have more folivores. Conversely, forests where most of the trees are highly defended with herbivore deterrent compounds and have low nutritional quality tend to be very poor habitat quality or even devoid of many folivorous species. Changes in forest composition can profoundly influence its nutritional quality and carrying capacity for leaf-eating animals. Landscape disturbance from natural and anthropogenic factors can alter tree species composition. This can happen through fire, timber harvesting, land clearing, grazing, droughts, flood, and even revegetation. Some trees do better with some forms of disturbance than other trees. When this disturbance happens, it can provide a competitive advantage for the disturbance-adapted species, and that's how they become more abundant. From what we know now about silvertop ash, it appears to be a disturbance-adapted species, at least to some forms of disturbance. It seeds prolifically after fire. It also has a very resilient seed bank, that can survive exposure and repeated drying, something that can happen when forest floors are disturbed from fire or logging. Silvertop ash is shade intolerant. It likes bright light where it will grow very fast and straight, and it has a slow rate of natural thinning. It will also readily coppice. These characteristics help it to outcompete other species in disturbed landscapes. Although silvertop can occur naturally as a monoculture or near monoculture, there is substantial evidence that silvertop is now more abundant than it was in the past, and that the dominance of silvertop in forests is increasing due to disturbance from fire and logging. Increasing silvertop dominance is bad news for biodiversity overall, and it seems to be particularly bad news for many eucalyptolivores like greater gliders and koalas. Compared to other species that often occur in the same area as silvertop, silvertop has very low available protein, which is an essential nutrient, and it can be a limiting nutrient for eucalyptolivores. Silvertop also has high UBFs, which are plant secondary compounds that deter feeding in many eucalyptolivores. Only eucalypt species from the monoclip subgenre make UBFs, which is why only the trees on the left are showing values for these plant secondary metabolites. The eucalypts on the right are from the symphymertal subgenre, and they don't make UBFs, but they have their own subgenre-specific herbivore deterrents. The pattern that we see in Eucalyptus sieveri, low nutrients and sky-high UBFs, has been relatively consistent in all the areas we have sampled. Now, this does not necessarily mean that eucalyptolivores can't eat silvertop at all, just that they probably can't eat very much, unless they're ringtail possum, which are more like goats, and that they can eat leaves from many eucalypts that other folivores won't. Other research has found that the proportion of silvertop increases in a landscape relative to other eucalypt species, and when that happens, the probability of detecting animals like koalas decreases. I've spoken to many ecologists who have observed the same pattern with greater gliders, and that's not surprising based on silvertop's chemical profile. Unfortunately, from everything we know about eucalypt nutrition right now, silvertop ash-dominated forests look like the one on the left. There are multiple lines of evidence that silvertop dominance is increasing across large areas of forest in southeastern New South Wales and East Gippsland, Victoria, as a result of direct and indirect anthropogenic landscape disturbance. So what are we going to do about it? I was at a workshop with someone from the New South Wales government who helped support some of our research into silvertop ash and its effect on habitat quality for eucalyptolivores. I told him that understanding the nutritional mechanism underpinning the loss of some animals from these disturbed eucalypt forests was one of the most important studies in which I had been involved. He said, "What are we going to do about it?" And I was like, "What do you mean? I have done what I'm supposed to do about it. I wrote a paper with my PhD student and we published it in Forest Ecology and Management." And he said, "No, I mean, what are we going to do about silvertop ash?" And I was like, "Oh, right. We probably should do something more than just figure out that this is a thing." I guess I thought that was someone else's job. However, as a scientist, I knew there was still more research to be done to figure out how we can reduce the proliferation of silvertop ash. That conversation really put a fire under me to get this started. So I'd like to say thank you for that, Rod. Fortunately, our lab at the Australian National University received funding from multiple sources to look into ways to reduce the proliferation of silvertop ash following disturbance and improve the nutritional value of those forests for greater gliders. In consultation with Victorian government, we decided to look at possible sites in East Gippsland that were recently harvested and regenerated. We needed to work in sites where most of the trees growing back were silvertop ash, and preferably relatively young silvertop ash to start with, since that would be a lot easier to tackle than mature trees. The regenerating sites would have undoubtedly had a lot of silvertop ash before they were harvested, and Vic forests follow established procedures with the aim to regenerate forests back to how they were before harvest. Many forest areas in East Gippsland have a long history of disturbance, though, and it is likely that the composition had substantially changed due to selective logging before Vic forests were even in the picture. From what we know of silvertop ash ecology, and from a few silvertop-specific studies and various records and reports on forests in the East Gippsland and South Coast areas, it is likely that silvertop continued to increase in abundance with each fire and/or logging disturbance event. We plan to undertake a series of landscape-scale experiments to trial methods to reduce the proportion of regenerating silvertop in favor of more palatable, locally appropriate tree species. The landscape scale experiments will consist of several different treatments, which will be compared to each other and control sites. These include thinning silvertop ash saplings and suppressing coppice regrowth, the same thinning and coppice suppression, but also revegetating with eucalypt seedlings grown in local nurseries, and thinning and coppice suppression followed by revegetation by direct seeding. There would also be the control sites in which we do nothing. The thinning of silvertop would happen manually with brush cutters because it's still small, and we would aim to have no more than 10 to 30% of silvertop remaining after any treatment in 4 years' time. For that to happen, we will probably attempt to remove most silvertop ash from the treatment plots to start with, because I'm fairly confident in its tenacity. We are working with accredited statisticians at the Australian National University to help us with the design of the study and sampling strategies to evaluate and model changes in the nutritional quality of plots based on the resulting tree species composition. We will likely use a block design for these experiments with 10 to 15 blocks across 2 or more coops. Each treatment plot will be relatively small in the first phase, and we will end up with a total of 40 to 55 plots. In deciding what to plant, we are consulting multiple sources to determine not just what the EVC is, but also what trees are present in the local area that may be appropriate at our site, even if they are not present now. We are not interested in restoring the same silvertop-dominated EVC, but seeing if and how we can shift it to locally appropriate tree species that will contribute to improving the nutritional landscape and overall biodiversity, particularly for threatened species like the greater glider. We have consulted the EVCs and species inventory from the coop plans to understand what species were observed before harvesting in the sites that we may end up using for this experiment. We have also looked at the EVC mapping and tree species lists available online. We have visited the sites with our project partner Envite Environment and our senior field officer Melinda Greenfield, who you will meet later in the session. This has helped us identify aspects that are better considered on the ground, even though most of them can also be viewed on maps. Things like topography, the presence of water, understory vegetation, and the surrounding landscape. We have consulted the Atlas of Living Australia records to see what trees have been recorded in the vicinity of the coops. We have also considered strongly what we know of the typical foraging preferences of greater gliders in East Gippsland, since the greater glider is a central focus of this project. We are considering what we know of the nutritional quality of various locally appropriate tree species that could be grown at this location. Lastly, we are hoping to get some feedback from foresters and forest ecologists at this workshop and beyond, and we can adapt our plans according to that feedback. Importantly, we aren't trying to recreate a specific EVC benchmark in our experimental plots. Rather, we are trying to see what species from those that the various sources say could be in the landscape will grow there. The resulting composition in the experimental plots will undoubtedly have higher nutritional and biodiversity value than the near monoculture of silvertop that those landscapes would have been. So these landscapes will not be worse off for the experiments either, and I truly believe that. We have sourced seed from several different sources, including CSIRO, Royal Melbourne Botanic Gardens, Wild Seed, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning from the Victorian Government, and Vic Forest. And I'd like to say a special thank you to DELP and Vic Forest for gifting this project eucalypt seeds for planting. The potential plots are in 2 broad forest types in East Gippsland, coastal forest and foothill forest, and there are a variety of EVCs across those. The seeds that we are using were collected from the same region as the plots and a similar elevation in almost all cases. This is a list of the tree species that we have both seed and growing seedlings. We won't plant those tree species like Fastigata that grow at higher elevation in the lower elevation coastal site and vice versa. There are some other species that we know grow in our area that we did not include, and at least in some cases, it's because there are already plenty around the site and they are typically very low quality food anyway, so we didn't want to plant more. That's things like silvertop and yourtop. The ins and outs of our ideas for implementing this work will be discussed immediately after my presentation by Matthew Kennedy from Envite, who we are partnering with to deliver this project. So I'll move on to the ongoing management and evaluation of the experimental plots. We will undertake pre- and post-treatment plot level vegetation surveys. These surveys will be ongoing for at least the next 3 to 4 years, which are already funded in terms of ANU's involvement. We will undertake ongoing silvertop sapling and coppice suppression for 3 years in the treatment plots. Our ultimate benchmark is how much silvertop is left in the various treatment sites compared to the control sites. We will also look at whether the need for ongoing silvertop suppression differs among treatments. We anticipate that the treatment sites will start at around 80 to 100% silvertop based on what we've seen there, and diminish to 10 to 30% following most treatment activities. We will also look at the survivorship and growth of various species from seedlings and direct seeding. We will undertake leaf sampling from the different tree species used in this study, and this will allow us to model how landscape nutritional quality changes as the tree species composition changes. We can then make predictions about what happens to forest nutritional quality when you vary the composition of these forests, and we can test these predictions with our plots. We will also evaluate the cost and time involved in the different treatment methods. Lastly, we are currently exploring opportunities for collaborating with other ecologists and foresters who might be interested in monitoring different aspects of the landscape. Envite Environment, for example, will also be undertaking pre- and post-treatment fauna surveys, and we are working with them on that component as well. However, the plots themselves are relatively small, and this type of change is needed on a larger scale before we can expect to see a response from larger folivore species like the greater glider. This is why we also hope to be able to roll out larger scale treatments in the second year after our initial experimental plots are established. These will be at least 5 hectares and hopefully not far from areas of more intact forest. This larger scale is the kind required to start to provide meaningful habitat for species like the greater glider. We can use some of our learnings from establishing our smaller scale plots that will hopefully help us refine our strategy for these larger plots too. For the larger plots, we're more interested in recreating high quality greater glider habitat than we are in seeing what locally appropriate tree species will grow. The proportion of different tree species in these larger plots will be key to making sure the habitat is excellent quality, not just for greater gliders, but for a variety of local flora and fauna. To have the best chance of achieving this, we will find areas as close as possible to our restoration sites with greater gliders and conduct point surveys to determine tree species composition and proportions. We will then sample seeds from those same trees for revegetation in the larger plots. We will do direct seeding in one plot and probably grow seedlings in nurseries to hand plant in the other. We will aim for similar proportions of tree species as what we found in the nearby greater glider habitat. These sites will also require ongoing maintenance for several years. There is funding already for ANU to drive this, and we are currently exploring additional funding options to keep Envite Environment involved with us beyond the first year, so they can help with these larger scale restoration sites as well. Over time, we will also be able to look at the nutritional quality of the trees growing in these larger plots with the seed sourced from nearby greater glider habitat and compare that to the nutritional quality of the trees growing in our experimental plots with seed sourced from more traditional sources. This will help us understand how important it might be or not to collect seeds from areas where we know there are trees that are palatable and make good habitat for species like the greater glider. In addition to vegetation surveys in these larger plots, we will conduct a number of different fauna surveys, monitor changes in microclimate, and we also hope to collaborate with other researchers who are interested in measuring and monitoring other aspects of the local ecology. So now we'll move on to the implementation strategy for this project with Matthew Kennedy from Envite Environment. Matt is the Environmental Projects Coordinator for Envite. He has over 20 years of experience working in the environmental conservation industry in government, not-for-profit, and private sectors. He is most experienced with riparian ecological restoration in Victoria and New South Wales, in both hands-on and managerial roles. He has rolled out projects installing 500,000 plants in one season on riparian zones in central Victoria and a major rainforest restoration project in East Gippsland. Even though he clearly has a lot of experience in this area, he is also keen to let people know that he knows there's always more to learn, and he is keen to do so, hopefully, by engaging with you all today. So I will now stop sharing my screen and turn this over to Matt as soon as I work out how to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, hello everybody. So yeah, as Cara said, my name is Matt Kennedy. I work for Envite as the Environmental Projects Coordinator. And I guess, you know, like my sort of thing is that I'm a practitioner. My background is out in the field, and I've done a lot of design and a lot of implementation of restoration programs. And I always stress the word restoration when I'm talking to people. You know, my feelings are that we always look at restoring habitats instead of just planting trees, which is one of my pet hates with people in the tree planting world. So just going to look at this restoring nutritional landscapes for threatened arboreal folivores. So about a month ago, I started this position, and my manager said, this is our project that we're going to work on, or one of the many projects we work on at Envite. And so we went out and we had a bit of a look at some of these coops, and the coops, not only had they been cleared for the forest harvest, but they'd also been burnt in the recent bushfires in East Gippsland. So they've got some really significant regrowth on them, and that's what I was trying to show with this slide here. And that really significant regrowth is problematic for us as people who do restoration work. So how do you introduce overstory species into this sort of environment like this? As you can see, it's really, really, really dense, and it's actually quite difficult to walk through to that point. And these, you can see the silvertop as poking its head out of the top of that. But when you look for other eucalypts in these coops, there's not many, and they are being suppressed already by the silvertop and by the other vegetation, particularly mid-story vegetation that's regenerated naturally. Most of those are acacia species. So this was the design brief, which Cara sort of outlaid before. So when we went to look, you know, I went to look at it and we went, okay, thinning, yeah, thinning will be really advantageous to the sites because the act of thinning does one really good thing for restoration is it introduces light. And I'm going to talk about light in a minute. So you can see we've got thinning and seedlings and thinning and then direct seeding. So that's another really important thing with direct seeding is you need light. So most people involved in restoration probably understand this thing that I'm talking about is the need for light. When we do restoration in riparian zones or in grasslands and in rainforests, we tend to have sites that are really, really, really degraded. And I can think mostly about a rainforest restoration site that was Kikuyu, that was 4 foot high, and you don't have much else growing in there except for a few scattered overstory species. So you get to spray it out and start with a clean slate. And when you've done that, you've got light there on the ground. So when you plant things and you do weed control, you can actually, you know, things grow, which is really important for what you're doing. You want to have success in your projects. So when we were looking at it, we're looking at the percentage of species, which Cara talked about, and which species we'd be choosing. And we are looking at planting eucalypts. At one stage, when I first looked at this project, I was asked, would we plant understory and mid-story species? No need, they're already there. So this is the foothill forest sites. Same process, this is what the trial is going to look like, and this is what we're going to do. And this is the species that we're going to be looking at in that. So Cara already showed that too. Here we go. So here we go for some issues. So browsing, ecological restoration and any sort of planting or direct seeding always has something eating it. whether it be bunnies, deer, or our best mate, the swamp wallaby. Now, swamp wallabies are very interesting animals, and I've spent a fair amount of time sitting at night with spotlights, observing them eating things on large rainforest restoration projects. And they're fairly interesting in the way that they feed. They tend to, if you've planted high density, they'll browse more evenly across the site. But if you've planted one tree every 5 metres, sort of thing, they tend to eat the whole plant before they can find the next one. It's a little bit hard to describe how they feed without actually acting it out, so I won't try and do that on screen. So we all know that deer are a major problem in eastern Victoria, and that they are basically eating most things, but they have real preferences to which species they eat. And in East Gippsland, we have genus Pomaderus, and one of the plants that they really hoe into is Pomaderus. So when I walk onto a site, if there is actually Pomaderus present and they're not being browsed, it tends to indicate to me that we don't have a heavy deer population in that site, which is always a good thing. So how do we go about it when we plant something? And we know we've got browsing animals. So the first thing I look at is, well, guarding. So guarding is used all the time. It's very effective, but it can be expensive. Especially, there's other aspects to guarding. The introduction of plastic onto your site if you're using plastic tree guards, and also the use of hardwood stakes when you're guarding. So if we were going to guard on these sites, I would be looking at the recycled cardboard guards with the bamboo stakes. The other thing that I have considered about these sites is the idea of using temporary fencing, which is mobile electric fencing. I've used it effectively on other sites, particularly with rainforest restoration, and it does do a fairly good job. And the good thing about it is you can be responsive when you're using temporary fencing. So if you've got an area that is being browsed, you can actually lift your fence up and move it and protect particular species or particular areas. So it's something I'd really like to work with. We've looked nowadays, everything runs off solar and runs off batteries, so that's very handy. Also looking at spraying deterrents. There's a product that you can spray that smells like rotten eggs, and you can spray it, and it's definitely a wallaby deterrent. And people involved in forestry know more about this than I do, but I've been told that it's reasonably effective. So one of the things you always look at is, are they there? So when we went out and looked at the coops, the sites, I was very interested in what scats were around, and I was also very interested in, was there any signs of any browsing? It was quite fascinating. Didn't see much. A little bit of deer scat, but not much being eaten. And when talking to other people, particularly Mel, who'd been out spotlighting at night in the areas, she wasn't seeing much wallabies. So I had a bit of a chat to my manager, and we think what we might be looking at is we might do some drone survey with thermal sensing, and we'll do nighttime stuff with the drones just to see what's actually there as far as our browsers go. Mainly because I don't want to spend a whole heap of money and effort protecting us from browsing if it's not actually happening. And it doesn't appear to be, but I would expect that at some stage we will face the issue, which is why I'm really looking at the temporary fencing idea. Okay, so lack of space and light for new plants, dense mid-story and understory regrowth. So how do we go about it? When we've got this amount of vegetation on the ground, I thought to myself, well, you know, normally when you're dealing with weeds, you get out the herbicide and you spray it and you kill it. But in this situation, it's all native. And I wasn't very comfortable with killing it. And I had a bit of a think and I thought, well, most of these plants that we're seeing here have basal nodes. And if I slashed it back down to the ground, I would get some light and some space, but I wouldn't kill the native plants, which would be really, really good. So when we do that, we would slash it and probably rake back a bit, and then we get space for our plants to go in so we could then plant. So when we get to thinning, we'll be cutting and painting using herbicide, and dab bottles we'll be slashing with our brush cutters. So yeah, that sort of makes sense. Preparation for planting the seedlings will be slashed with brush cutters to ground level to introduce light and space, but not kill the understory species. We'll be using tube stock, which we've already got contractors growing for us, and we'll probably be using Hamilton tree planters or little drill augers. When we get to the direct seeding side of things, we will be dispersing the seed manually. I wanted to finish with this little picture here because this is a sun orchid, native sun orchid, and this is actually growing where we're going to do our trials. So it was to give you an idea of, you know, the coops are, they've got good diversity. They're functioning ecologically as far as I can see, except they don't provide any nutritional folivore species. So, you know, I was always under the thought that we have to tread a little bit gently. So I think I'm starting to come up with a bit of a plan on how we might implement the project. Yeah, and that's sort of where I'm at. I was very, very keen to talk to people who were practitioners and to see what they thought, and if anybody could give me some feedback, because we are basically, I'm designing the works from my experience and trying to solve a problem as I went along. So, yep, that's sort of me. If anybody got any questions, I'd love to talk to them.
Our next speaker is Patrick Pigott. Patrick works as a research ecologist with Parks Victoria Environment and Science Division in the Environmental Research Partnership and Programs Unit. He has extensive experience working on large environmental management initiatives across the government, private, and university sector. Current activities include working with research partners, students, and scientists, and providing advice to Parks Victoria staff on implementation of environmental projects. Some of the ecological research and strategy planning issues Patrick has worked on over the years include conservation of remnant vegetation, management of ecological weeds and pest animals, and ecological thinning in box ironbark and riverbed gum forests. All right, thank you, Patrick. Now I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Cara, and thanks for inviting me, and I hope that you enjoy this story. I became involved in this project about 6 months into its planning phase, and I've ended up a custodian of sorts. I've had a number of roles in and out of Parks Victoria in the sort of grey space between university research and Parks Victoria, particularly large initiative programs where state government is setting up new park systems, and there are usually 3 or 4 year initiatives. Environmental thinning or ecological thinning has been a theme now in both box ironbark and red gum environments, but it's yet to be adopted as a mainstream methodology. So this project started again in the ECC inquiry nearly 20 years ago, after concern from community and scientists that the fragmented and degrading nature of box ironbark forests and woodlands was a significant issue. The government transferred a sizable amount of box ironbark forests from the commercial forestry network into parks and reserves. And it was proposed that an ecological management strategy be devised, and that include thinning. So Parks Victoria's response was to set up a trial. The culture at the time was effectively nature conservation, planning, a bit of pest, plants and animals, but there was really no culture of chopping down trees. So this was a really difficult thing for a lot of people to grapple with, and a lot of external people were involved. So in that planning phase in 2003, one of the workshops came up with this vision as part of this planning process, that box ironbark forest woodlands be a mosaic landscape with greater diversity of habitat, including open areas with larger numbers of hollow-bearing trees. So I've just got a picture there of a grey box in a sort of senescing phase with an Aboriginal scar. It's certainly not the biggest that used to be around, but it's just an example of trees that have predominantly gone missing from the whole sort of 100,000 square kilometre landscape. So just very briefly, like I mentioned, thinning was a foreign idea for many people who had worked in planning and research in the national parks sector, and they had to grapple with this. So it's an established, a very accepted part of forest silviculture going back hundreds and hundreds of years in Europe and North America, and established in Australia for managing commercial forests. And it can either be removing seedlings or saplings in a plantation, or taking out less desirable trees around a selected potential production tree. And there are lots of different sorts of ways of estimating how you go about thinning. You either thin around a desirable tree, or you measure the canopy from above or below in a theoretical sense, and you estimate how much you want to cut the forest back to. Tree density is also important, but the size of existing trees is extremely important. So ecological thinning is just a methodology where the objective is environmental or conservation focused rather than commercial or services like water. So this trial was set up over, hang on a second, just making sure I didn't miss a slide. No, I haven't missed a slide. Four sites across the central goldfields in Victoria, just south of the city of Bendigo, which is where I live and work. And these were all sites that were being changed primarily, or being drawn into the new conservation estate, and it meant that their tenures made it less controversial to work on than the A-class national parks. So we had 4 sites. There was extensive planning around the type of thinning, and there was also a second sub-treatment element of removing debris, felled timber at different scales. And there was also extensive discussion about monitoring post-thinning in the area's biodiversity, forest structure and habitat. So just very quickly, there were 3 types of thinning. The conventional thinning or isolated as it became known was really about thinning around the tree that you were choosing to leave and approximately 50% removal from the pre-thinning landscape. And then a heavy thinning, which was thinning down to 25%, but retaining some small patches, and a sort of hybrid where it was very similar to the first treatment, but 25% of the area being retained in unthinned patches. So I have to say at this stage, I missed out at the beginning that the very large amounts of the remnant box ironbark landscape to this day has a history of extensive clearing and cutting, and a lot of the woodlands are coppice regenerated or very small stem, much as in the first slide I showed at the beginning, and I've got some other slides I'll show in a minute. So the context, unlike tall wet forests, the context is that you have quite old trees that have regrown from stumps with small stems. So in some cases you'll have 5 or 6 small stems from a relatively large stump, maybe 40, 50, 60 centimetres, and they can be up to 100 years old. So the history of many of these reserves in a very widely cleared agricultural landscape is one of literally clear felling in the gold rushes as people raced to find gold, but also access resources for building buildings and mine shaft props and firewood and just about everything else we use timber for. And so the remnant forests are predominantly very small stem but mature trees, and the original structure of large veterans with open areas in between, open grassy shrubby areas, is quite unusual. And so thinning really was a favoured method to try to reverse that trend, to try to explore how we could open up as well as speed up growth of selected trees. The other interesting thing which has come up today that I noticed is that this extensive history of modification and disturbance has changed the composition of box ironbark. So over time, there are some species that have been favoured for commercial forestry or firewood, which meant that the composition or the arrangements of trees in box ironbark forests have changed as well. And there's half a dozen or so eucalypts, but they all had different values and purposes. And so it's very hard, even though we have ecological vegetation classes in Victoria with baseline ideas about eucalypt composition, we really don't have a good understanding of what the forests looked like 150 years ago. So look, I'll whiz through the next bit because I realise that there's a time limit. So my next few slides come from one of our sites south of Heathcote, Spring Plains Nature Conservation Reserve. And this is a really good way to see the basics of this trial. And you can see on the left that there are 4 blocks. And I'll just try to show with my mouse that you can see the 3 different thinning treatments. These blocks were at 30 hectare scale. So it's a very, very different approach to what you're planning in East Gippsland. And the reason for that was that the scientists who helped design the project really wanted something that was applicable, so that in the future the management scale could be visible, because the whole idea was to transfer the knowledge into the sort of mainstream park management. So the top thinning here was this isolated or conventional thinning, where selected trees to be left were spaced out. And you can see that it's a bit hard to see from top down, but you can see the trees left are reasonably well spaced out. Then the next site down here was actually the heavy thinning. And you can see a couple of these little patches. These are representing the 10% left as remnants, but you can see that the canopy is much more open. And so this was a much harder thinning, and the idea behind that was really to see, because box ironbark species are so slow growing, if in fact the less attractive idea of very heavy forest thinning actually sped up the growth of the trees that you were trying to promote as habitat trees. Then the third site here is just control. And then the fourth site was the hybrid of the conventional thinning with the much larger patches left behind. And you can see this is a recent Google Earth photo of the same view, and you can see how effectively the canopy across all of these sites is filled in, and it's really only the control site which is still a bit dense in the top-down environment. On the ground, it looks quite different, and I have got some photos. So this is in the top site here. So these photos are taken up here where I'm just pointing my mouse, so just in this corner here, in the conventional thinning. This is pre-thinning, and you can see a little bit of the coppice here, and away in the distance there, you can see there's a little bit of a coppicing. There's also a little bit of open space. This is by no means as dense as other sites like Castlemaine Diggings. This is the post-thinning site. So actually at this site, there are already existing quite a few large trees. So this one's here. This is these are actually mostly red stringy barks in the view, but also some grey and red box around, and you can see piles of debris. This green post in the foreground represents a 1 hectare timber removal treatment, which I won't talk much about except from the lessons learnt bit. But you can see there now, as we go to only a couple of months ago, you can see that the understory, particularly grasses and small shrubs, have grown back. This is approximately 17, 18 years. And you can see now that the habitat has changed considerably from that to that. So you have a much more open forest with sort of maturing understory. And in the distance, going up the other slope, there are a lot more sort of chest-high shrubs, and the canopy is also filled out, although that hasn't been measured. Now, in context again, this is a very, very different landscape to East Gippsland, and so the habitat it really is geared around a whole suite of birds and critical weight range mammals, which are a little bit different. And one of the outcomes from the pre and post thinning research was that in this landscape, mammal distribution was very cautious and very hard to measure. So there was a bit of trapping, and we used hair tubes as well. And really, site by site, the results were so variable it was almost impossible to figure out if there were any effects. But it was also, I guess, disappointing that the occurrence of small mammals in the landscape was in fact very poor. The distribution of birds and bats was another story. So distribution of bats was reasonably healthy. So here's one of the do nots in scientific presentations, a very wordy, crowded slide. but I just threw this in so you can see the sorts of things we're trying to measure across habitat diversity, biodiversity and forest structure. And ultimately, there was a whole lot of stuff left out, like measuring soil properties and reptiles, which we got to do a bit later. But things like tree hollows, the spatial dimensions of the forest, so the density and things like diameter and so on. Just quickly, some photos from other sites. So Castlemaine Diggings, which is about 70 or 80 kilometres from the other site, was actually in a newly established park that had a focus on preserving the Gold Rush diggings landscape. So there are lots of artefacts in this particular landscape. Whilst some people didn't want the thinning trial to go in here at all, because of that landscape, it did prove quite useful because it's very hilly and very, very dense coppice regenerated forest. So it did produce quite a good alternative to the other sites. And you can see here there's grey box and red stringy bark. This type of forest's called heathy dry EBC, as opposed to the conventional box ironbark EBC, which is dominated by red stringy bark, red ironbark. So here again, a bit further along with the less harsh thinning, and you can see here's one of these larger patches that's been left behind, and that gives you an idea of how dense the remnant forest is and how small the trees are in relation to what we know as veteran eucalypts. And here's the site at Paddy's Ranges, again another 60 or 70 kilometres to the west. And this is a site that's dominated by red ironbark and also acacias and a few other understory species. So quite a different type of landscape, a very flat landscape, and again, very few large trees. And I'll put this photo in. This is the fourth site, just for comparison. This is also heathy dry, but this particular site, which was the site of the heavy treatment, heavy thinning treatment, had a lot of mature trees, and so when the thinning formula was calculated, that meant that the resultant thinning was very, very open and a bit alarming to some people, I guess, looking from the outside. And you can see at the top of the hill there's one of those little tiny patches. So just some quick operations photos, measuring basal area, setting up the gear for the day. So I had to get a chainsaw in there somewhere. Painting with herbicide, and just a stockpile of billets. I think this was at Spring Plains in one of the denser sites, and I'll refer back to that in a minute. So we ended up getting some quite interesting results from the original post-thinning monitoring, such as an obvious increase in coarse woody debris volume structure, increased fine debris and litter, observable changes to understory structure, some changes in faunal functional groups. So they were mostly birds and bats, where they're certainly with birds, the data was analysed in as well as species, but also different feeding groups. It's quite a useful way to examine bird communities. And of course, open canopy, increased light, which we ultimately got an empirical measurement when an honours student did some work on reptiles at 3 of the sites. So that was quite revealing to have an empirical measurement of canopy openness. Really, the only downside that was ever raised across all of the sites was that you get a short-term invasion of herbaceous weeds associated with gully runoff. One of the structural or landscape problems in box ironbark country is that in a highly degraded landscape, there is deep gully erosion after storms, and that remains an issue for long-term rehabilitation of some sites. There's quite deep unnatural gullies, and there's also the opposite, where traditionally natural streams flowed. They've been dammed up by goldfield or forest era dams or structures that obstruct the natural flow. And then finally, one of the things we did in 2015 have a project to remeasure trees, and interestingly, the growth across the species and sites was larger than had been predicted at that stage, which some sites were only 8 or 9 years, but the trees had grown. I guess by implication, the treatments were working. So what do we learn about this? What are some of the things that came out of this project from a non-biological sense? It's a very large project, as I've indicated. It was funded by the Box Ironbark Parks and Reserves program in 2003, which came out of a new Act of Parliament. It also came with tied funding, so the government made a promise to opposition at the time to have a labour program to allow some work for timber workers who are going to be have difficulty transferring out of what was then a fading commercial timber industry. So we ended up with 3 or 4 people in the thinning crews who were older men who had extensive experience in tree felling, and that was all round very well received, and I think younger people involved learned a lot from those people. But as I said before, the National Park Service didn't really have a history of managing a project like this, and so there were some cultural obstacles. And finally, on this slide, the research coordination planning team that I came into was managed quite separately from operations, and that was really a result of the way that Parks Victoria was set up. At that stage, Parks Victoria was only about 7 or 8 years old and still having a growing pains, I guess. And there was quite a distinct difference between the statewide groups and the operational teams. There is still today, but it's less obvious than it was in those times. So again, some terribly wordy slides, and I'll attempt to whiz past. And at any stage, Cara, you can cut me off if I'm going over time. But development aims and objectives. There was extensive workshopping at the beginning of this project, and some very clever people involved in designing the project and setting the monitoring parameters. There was a really strong emphasis on very good science behind the trial, and a scientific advisory committee was set up with ultimately people who today are very well recognised professor level academics, as well as some really, really good people in the research branch. And I'm privileged to work with two of those people today, Marie Keatley and John Wright, who's my manager. They've still retained an interest, and of course lots of corporate knowledge. It's a rare thing these days in state government. But the thinning design, as I've mentioned before, was really set. The design of the thinning went against the conventional use of basal area to set parameters. So a reduction by percentage rather than setting a minimum basal area baseline, and that went on to, in fact, to have consequences, which I'll mention in a minute. Again, a lot of design and work into the select the parameters, the sites, plot, subplot, monitoring, etc. And a later addition to this idea of debris removal. And I think there was an agreement that there was a management interest, because to this day, firewood theft in Box Ironbark is a thing. And in fact, the whole of Northern Victoria remains a problem for compliance officers in Parks Victoria and DELT because of a illegal take. But there was concern that following thinning, a lot of material will be stolen from the trial sites. Ultimately, didn't happen, but we ended up with a really interesting project at 1 hectare scale. And to this day, there's a really good footprint of trying to understand the role of coarse woody debris in a landscape that is quite depauperate in decent coarse woody debris. And woody debris is really important for small mammals such as yellow-footed antechinus and brush-tailed phascogale, and a whole suite of birds. And Central Victoria has a whole threatened bird community, which is FFG listed, and that the conservation of those are problematic. So the site selection ended up being a little bit of a problem. It was entirely carried out by operations staff who had very good working knowledge, but perhaps less science or exposure to research parameters. The science team didn't have much to do with this, partially because of the communications issues, but also the time constraints, because there was pressure on by the organisation and by then Department of Sustainability and Environment, who were funding this and who had control over Parks Victoria in a way that they don't anymore. So there was a lot of pressure to get cracking, so to speak. And the emphasis on site selection tended to be tenure and logistics rather than some of the ecological stuff like terrain and EBC. The major issue really that determined a lot of problems to come in this project was that forest structure and stem density and age class distribution wasn't surveyed before the plots were set up. So the forest tended to be much denser than originally thought, and stem densities up to 3 or 4 times. Castlemaine diggings, I think, 3.5 times the density of stems than were sort of calculated back of the envelope by people. And that determined, it had an enormous amount of constraint on the time it took to thin sites and the time it took to remove debris from the 1 hectare subplots. And that became a major issue. There are also ramifications for site selection. There's some of the sites like Castlemaine diggings, the hybrid thinning site was on very, very hilly terrain, as was part of the heavy thinning site, and that in the middle of winter had enormous ramifications for safety of workers. The organisation had made it, because of the tied labour model, the workers were all temporary employees of Parks Victoria, so it was the organisation's direct responsibility for welfare, and there were a number of minor accidents because of slippery terrain, because timber had to be and equipment had to be carried around, and that was quite a drama. And I think it's different to the project you're considering because of the scale. So 30 hectares is quite a big area. There was also an issue with staff continuity and training. Most of the tide workers hung around for the sort of 3 years, but there was a bit of a turnover of younger people who got some training and work experience and then got other employment within Parks Victoria or went to other jobs. And there was also a personality clash between two crew leaders who didn't really agree on the interpretation of how you go about this kind of new experimental idea of ecological thinning. And finally, just to mention that the project, which ultimately ran for nearly 3 years, wouldn't have been possible without volunteers across a range of community groups who volunteered for various reasons, including access to firewood for people in need. I've touched on this before. Monitoring projects, ultimately, the project ended up being carried out over 3 years, 2004, 5, 6, because effectively thinning took nearly 3 years instead of about 15 months, and that was for the reasons I'd explained. Just the I guess the lack of understanding as to how long it would take, and the amount of work involved in not just the thinning and the actual manual felling, but also the removal of debris. So I think across the whole project, at least twice as many trees were felled than originally estimated. And the reason that was an issue was because instead of using, as in conventional site management for forest stands, where usually a basal area of about 12 to 15 hectares was set for a site, depending on its existing condition. This project used that sort of top-down percentage reduction, and that meant that the sort of end result was quite different, almost site by site, plot by plot. And ultimately, that meant that in the future, the use of the estimate technique is probably not repeatable over time. So the use of a triangular tessellation technique to estimate stem density in basal area using a sort of geometric mathematical principle is not repeatable because of the differences, but that's another story. Again, in monitoring, none of this was possible without our research partners. Parks Victoria has a 25-year history with now 11 universities across southeastern Australia of delivering very high value research across a whole range of topics and partnerships. And this was again a fantastic example of our university partners working with us to deliver monitoring and research. If there was a downside, it was just the lack of opportunity and time to cross-collaborate. It did come about later with an extensive assessment of all of the data pulled together. We had some great workshops where everyone came together on that. So after this period, and because there was some doubt that the design had been implemented correctly, in 2007, I undertook an audit across all the sites. So I effectively visited every plot and every subplot and made an evaluation against the methodology and to try to figure out if the thinning had been implemented as desired, and certainly as it transpired, the thinning treatments were implemented correctly. At some places, the thinning patches were perhaps more geometric than sort of rounded, if you like, and that's really a visual thing. I don't know that wildlife know or care what shape a remnant patch looks like, but the way that trees were selected and remnants left had been a bit of an irritant to some people. The debris removal treatment, on the other hand, was much more problematic because there were mix-ups with treatments on particular plots, and some of the treatments looked like they hadn't been implemented properly. As time goes by, we see that the considerable variation across the sites and the thinning plots and the subplots fades, because if in the future, if all of those sites are treated as separate entities rather than replicated, the data is extremely valuable over time, because as we all appreciate in ecology, long-term monitoring is priceless, and we learn lots and lots of things that we don't get to know with just before and after. There's my little plug for things to come.
Sorry, we're just going to have to wrap up in about 2 minutes, if that's okay.
Yep, no, I'm nearly there. So perfect. I'm nearly there. Thanks for that. So look, just very briefly, one of the things that the organisations had to tackle with its obligation, particularly in Northern Victoria around firewood, is the use of machinery. So we can't use thinning crews in a traditional sense. It has to be machine thinning these days, which is an OH&S issue. And look, I've just put in there a plug for the public land managers to take up thinning as a mainstream technique. And just thanks, here's a picture early on of the Scientific Advisory Committee with some of the work crew, and a little bit of yellow box with a nice mature tree. So thanks for listening.
Last, and definitely not least, I would like to introduce you all to my colleague, Melinda Greenfield. She's actually going to introduce herself to you so that she can tell you about how you can get in touch with us to continue the discussion or get more involved in this exciting restoration work in the future. And she's our senior field research officer there, and also involved in community engagement and outreach. And hopefully joining her next year, if she can get back to Australia, is Denise McGregor, who's online with us here today as well, who got trapped in the pandemic overseas. But we're hoping that she joins us, and Mel will tell you more about both of them and the work that they're doing on the ground. So without further ado, Mel, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Cara. Hello, everyone. My name's Melinda Greenfield, but everyone calls me Mel. And as already mentioned, I'm a local engagement and field research officer from ANU, and I have a background in studying interactions between plants and animals and fungi. I moved down here to Marlow, which is near Orbost in East Gippsland, as many of you might know, back in May this year. So I moved down here so that I'm close to the field sites where we are doing this experiment. And I'm working closely, obviously, with Cara from ANU and Abby and Matt from Envite, who you've heard from today, on this project. And my role involves a lot of field work. So you can see from this photo, I don't know if it's actually that's better over there. This is the type of, this is one of the logging coops that I've visited. So I've visited many of these, and you can see all the silver top ash. And the other reason I'm based down here is to engage with community members, traditional owners, and other stakeholders and collaborators such as DELP. So, sorry, just one minute. Today, I'm giving a very short talk to point out a few things about our website and also potential opportunities for people to be involved with our project. So this is the website address up here. And you're probably already familiar with our website because you would have registered here for today's workshop. And this is where you can access the keynotes, as Cara already mentioned. If you haven't had time to watch these, you can find them in here and watch them later. We'll also be adding a couple of other tabs here, including a project updates page where we'll put information and photos showing progress of the project, and another tab called volunteering. So if you're interested in helping us out during this project, you can go to this tab to look at opportunities to get involved with the project. And I'll just go through some of the ideas we have for volunteers at the moment. So this is once the experiment is set up. So after that, there'll be some opportunities to volunteer, including monitoring growth and survival of the eucalypt seedlings. As Cara and Matt mentioned, we'll have seedling treatments and seed treatments, so we'll need to monitor them over time for survival and growth. And one of the issues, as Matt mentioned, would be browsing. So wallabies, deer, also insects. So, and dealing with that as necessary. Matt also mentioned the potential to use like an electric fence tape, and that'll need to be maintained as well if we do use it. It might also be, and probably will be, necessary to continue to thin silvertop ash, because it's likely it will keep coming out of the soil in the plots, in the experimental plots, and so we'll have to deal with that. And as was mentioned as well, in the future, we hope to scale up projects like this and do larger revegetation efforts. So that could also open up some opportunities to help us out and volunteer. Also, I've been doing a lot of spotlighting in this region since I moved here back in May, and we're planning to do more, and also possibly doing stag watching in the future. So if you're interested in coming out with us to find greater gliders, and we also see other nocturnal animals, let us know. It's a lot of fun spotlighting, but you do need to be a bit nocturnal yourself, as we are out until quite late in the evening. The other tab we wanted to point out is this one here, the Contact Us tab. So if you click on that, it'll open up to this page. And this here is our email address. So if you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do so using this email. And also, if you have any ideas for research that could be carried out alongside our project, please get in touch with us via this email. And finally, as Cara just mentioned, we'll have a new member to our team early next year, and that's Denise McGregor. So Denise will be joining our group, and she'll be based down here in Victoria as well. Denise has a lot of experience with greater gliders from her PhD research on them, and she's worked in the forest down here in Victoria and also up in Queensland. So we're looking forward to having Denise back here, and yeah, in the new year. So that's it from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Mel. That's really great. And it's so wonderful to have you down there and helping with this project. It really takes a village to try to tackle something like this and landscape scale work. And I think everyone who's been involved, I'll go through that in just a minute. So I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us today and for sharing your insights and experience. We'll take on board the discussions and learning from this workshop, and we hope that we have more opportunities in the future to engage with many of you. As Mel mentioned, the workshop website will evolve into a website for Restoring Nutritional Landscapes projects. So please check in from time to time if you're interested in knowing how the Silvertop project is progressing. We also welcome anyone to get in touch with us if there are possible synergies between your interests and the Silvertop project or any other ideas presented here today. I would like to thank our project partners, without whose support the Silvertop project would not be possible. So thank you to the Victorian Government, the Australian National University Fenner School of Environment and Society and Research School of Biology, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and thank you also Vic Forest, DELP, CSIRO, Royal Botanic Gardens, Muji Aboriginal Council, Wild Seed, and Snowy River Riparian for helping us to source and grow seed and plants for the Silvertop project. And thank you also to all of our speakers today and to all of you for your interest and involvement in restoring nutritional landscapes. And I look forward to carrying on this conversation in the future.